Welcome to the Lowenstein Sandler podcast series, the Women's Initiative Network, Real Talk. I'm Amanda Cipriano, an associate attorney and member of the Women's Initiative Network at Lowenstein Sandler. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe to our podcast series at lowenstein.com/podcasts, or find us on iTunes, Spotify, Pandora, Google Podcasts, and SoundCloud. Now let's take a listen. Welcome to the Women's Initiative Network, Real Talk. My name is Amanda Cipriano, and I'm an associate in Lowenstein's White Collar Practice Group.
I'm Nicole Fulfree, and I'm a partner in Lowenstein's Bankruptcy and Restructuring Department.
I'm Markiana Julceus, and I'm an associate in Lowenstein's White Collar Litigation Group.
And hi, I'm Mikayla Berliner, and I am a new associate in the Litigation Department.
Each year, New Jersey state courts hire approximately 500 recent law school graduates to serve as judicial law clerks in the state's court system. And that's not including the many hundreds of law clerks serving in the federal court system throughout the state and the rest of the country. These law clerks spend a year or more working closely in chambers with a judge, helping review filings, prepare for hearings, research novel issues, conduct trials, and write judicial opinions. These interactions in chambers cultivate a close and personal mentoring relationship for many. The clerkship experience is one people rave about. In today's episode, we are talking about what happens after the clerkship ends. We will hear from 3 former law clerks about the transition from law clerk to new associate at a large law firm. To get started, could you each talk about when you clerked, for what court, and what you did after your clerkship?
Yeah, so I'll get started. I did a New Jersey Supreme Court clerkship right after I graduated from the 2021 to 2022 term. And then I started at the firm this past September.
I also did a New Jersey Supreme Court clerkship right after graduating from law school. That was the 2017 to 2018 term. And then I joined the firm as a second-year associate in the fall of 2018. And then I decided to clerk again. So then I spent 2 years clerking in the federal district court for the District of New Jersey. And I returned to the firm in the summer of 2021.
And so I clerked for a bankruptcy judge in the District of New Jersey. And I'm aging myself now compared to you guys at least, but that was back in the 2013, 2014 term. So I basically graduated from law school in 2013, started my clerkship in August of 2013 and stayed there with my judge for a year. And then I started at Lowenstein in September 2014, and the rest is history. I've been here ever since.
So does someone have to go right from law school to a clerkship?
No, not at all. I think it's really a personal decision about when clerking fits into your professional career. And it's different for everybody. There's a lot of things that can impact the timing. For me personally, I always knew I wanted to clerk. So my 2 year of law school, I applied for the New Jersey Supreme Court clerkship. And the New Jersey State Court has like a very specific hiring timeline. You can't apply any earlier than the prior term. So for my clerkship in the summer of 2017, I applied in the summer of 2016. And the federal judges have a very different hiring timeline. They're each kind of on their own schedules. So it can be kind of unpredictable if you're looking for a federal clerkship. Some of the judges are hiring for a term immediately. Others are hiring for future terms. So, for example, when I clerked in federal court, I interviewed in April, and the judge that I interviewed with needed somebody for an immediate start. So I literally started that same May. And the firm was incredibly supportive of my decision to go to federal court and really kind of learn the ins and outs of federal practice. And they really encouraged me to kind of go off and left the door open to come back if I wanted to. So the firm was incredibly supportive, which made it possible for me to kind of do both things. I got to clerk right out of law school and again later on in my career.
It is nice to hear that people go right after law school and then also after working. I will be starting a clerkship in the fall, which I applied to two or 3 years ago. So that's in the federal courts. So the timeline is very different. Mikayla, why did you choose to do a clerkship?
So I really wanted to learn the ins and outs and how a judge thinks. And I had also heard really great things about it. So when everyone seemed to be raving about the clerkships that they did, I knew that I wanted to take advantage of that. And like Markiana was saying, the state court is a very specific timeline and they typically hire right out of law school. So I really wanted to take advantage of that opportunity and do that as soon as I could. And then I'm actually also doing a federal clerkship this coming fall, which I applied to during my first clerkship. So I loved it so much that I was like, I just need to do another one.
Good job. So nice. You had to do it twice.
Yes, exactly. So I'm really excited about that. And I think it really exceeded all my expectations. I think I went into it knowing that everyone loves it. And I went into it knowing I would learn a lot. But the actual one-to-one interaction with your judge is just so unique, especially to start your career. And you get the type of close relationship and mentoring that is just irreplaceable, in my opinion.
And Nicole, as someone a little more far out from their clerkship than Mikayla and Markiana, what were some of the biggest benefits that you still see in your practice today that positively impact your career?
It's okay, Amanda, you can say older. Especially being in a specialized practice area. I'm in the bankruptcy and restructuring department. The clerkship provided me with a really broad exposure to all different types of bankruptcy matters and issues in a very short period. So it was kind of like a fast track to learning how to be a bankruptcy attorney. Even if you've taken bankruptcy courses in law school, there's so many different types of representations within bankruptcy. And so attorneys who go straight into practice might get pigeonholed really quickly into being, for example, a debtor's attorney or a creditor's attorney and so on. But getting exposure to all different kinds of lawyers, matters, and cases was a really great way to start understanding how different aspects of the practice worked. And so that was really helpful earlier on in my career. It also, at the beginning, gave me a lot more confidence in dealing with other attorneys. I think I would be really nervous to interact with other attorneys because when you start out, basically every attorney that you're dealing with is more senior to you. But when you're the clerk, the attorneys automatically treat you with this super high level of respect, which I felt at the time definitely wasn't warranted. I had no idea what I was doing. I was just learning what an order was. I, was learning how the practice of law worked. But then when the attorneys call you, and they treat you with this, such respect because they're calling chambers. And it really gave me a really good confidence boost in just dealing with other attorneys at an early stage in my career. And then now that I'm a little bit more senior, Amanda, I think it helped me with my interactions with judges and chambers. I think I've learned to pay really close attention to judges' questions and kind of get into their mindset and where they're going with something and whether I need to change my argument in court based on the questions that they're asking and how to respond to them and kind of just how they think. So that's been helpful as I've been interacting with courts more in oral argument and so on. And then a sort of unexpected one was the ongoing relationships I've gained with the other clerks who clerked for my judge. There were, I think, 14 of us during his full term. And we actually go out to dinner every single year with the judge and his staff. And all of us 14 clerks who clerked for the judge at some point, some of whom I'd worked with and transitioned with, some of whom I'd never met until those dinners. But it's a really great way to keep in touch with everyone. And it's a really good networking opportunity as well. So I think, from earlier stage to now, the later stage of my career, it's helped me with a bunch of different aspects of my career.
And I just jumping in on that, I will say that kind of unexpected benefit that you mentioned rings so true for me as well. I mean, one of the judges that I clerked for, she refers to her network of former clerks, of which there are an abundance of us because she was on the bench for over 30 years, as her legacy. And she considers her clerks to be part of her family. And I can imagine that there's not a single one of them that, like, whether I've met them at one of the judges' kind of dinner parties or events that she hosts for her former clerks, like if I asked her to pick up the phone and call one of them to like help me with something or ask a question, they would do it in a heartbeat.
I totally agree. And I think it's also funny because Markiana and I clerked for the same justice on the New Jersey Supreme Court. And so I felt like I had someone looking after me who I'd never even met, but the justice spoke so highly of her that I was like, okay, good. I have, someone there to look after me. And she definitely has done that, not only because it's her personality, but I think also just because we have that connection. And I think my co-clerks both got jobs through other prior clerks that our justice had. So I think it is a really great networking tool as well.
Yeah, because I think everybody thinks of, hey, I'm going to clerk, I'm going to make these connections with this judge, I'm going to get this great experience. And it really goes beyond the judge, him or herself, right? Like you get the benefit of the judge's entire network, in addition to, of course, the practical skills that you pick up while you're clerking.
And so speaking of practical skills, Markiana, can you talk a little bit about the different types of things you learned in your first, your second clerkship, and whether there were any differences and things that stood out from each?
Sure. So my first clerkship was on the New Jersey Supreme Court. So that was obviously an appellate level clerkship. And then my second clerkship was in the District of New Jersey, which is obviously a trial court. So there were very distinct differences in kind of the workload and like not the workload itself, actually, I guess that's not the right word, is the type of work. On like a macro level, it's exactly the same, right? Because you're doing the same kinds of things. You're doing legal research and writing, and you're helping resolve whatever the case is before you. But on a micro level, they are very different. Like my appellate level clerkship, I can probably count how many times the phone rang while I was clerking. And most of the time it was another justice like calling to ask to speak to my justice, right? But when I clerked in the trial court, the phone rang like probably 100 times a day. And it was always litigants or counsel. And so that's one distinct difference, is that an appellate level clerkship is a lot quieter. And I mean, the way you look at the issues are different as an appeals court, because especially when you're clerking for the New Jersey Supreme Court, it's the highest court in the state, and you are resolving really critical constitutional issues or matters of first impression. So everything that comes across your desk is new. It would probably be new to you anyway, because you're new and you're fresh out of law school. But it is typically new to almost everybody involved, which is both refreshing, but also kind of scary. And so the way you look at the questions are a little bit different, because you're kind of trying to figure out, hey, how should the court deal with this? Like, what is the right answer for the citizens of the whole state? How should this statute be interpreted? Or how do we want to interpret this particular Fourth Amendment issue? Do we want to treat it differently than how the Supreme Court of the United States treats it? So the questions are a little bit different. And then when I was clerking in the trial court, the types of issues, I mean, by 6 months into my clerkship, the types of things I was seeing, I had seen time and time again, right? A personal jurisdiction motion, the specific arguments the parties are going to make differs, but the law is exactly the same every time. And there's some comfort in that because you become familiar with it very quickly. And I always, I felt like probably the first 9 months of my clerkship, I was kind of very scrambled and confused. But once I hit that 9-month mark, I was like, hey, I've seen this before. I can do this. I know what the right answer is. And so that last year and a half was it wasn't a breeze by any means, but it was nice to really get a familiarity with the law on those kinds of issues. And you also have parties coming in and out and appearing before you, right? So you get to kind of see how people argue motions. You get to see what a motion to dismiss should look like and really get into the nitty gritty of what good briefs and bad briefs look like. And those who have the benefit of clerking for a magistrate judge in the federal court in New Jersey, our magistrate judges handle basically everything from when the complaint is filed up through discovery. Basically, any non-dispositive motions go to the magistrate judges. And I always say that the people who clerk for magistrate judges, that is the best primer for being a litigation associate. Because a junior litigation associate, discovery is your bread and butter. The bulk of what you do is going to be handling discovery, the nuts and bolts of that. And so really having kind of the ability to see what discovery in a case should look like from beginning to end, and seeing where the pitfalls are and what happens when opposing counsel threatens to call a judge into deposition and those kinds of things, I think is just a really awesome experience that people who clerk for magistrate judges get to have.
And Mikayla, as going on your 6th month here at the firm, how has your transition been from clerkship to firm life?
I would say it was a stark difference. So, I mean, I'm sure transitioning straight from law school also obviously has its challenges, but I did have the benefit of being a working person for a year already. So, I was used to getting up and starting work and having, the work week. And so it wasn't as big of a transition in that sense. I also think that my research and writing skills had a full year to really develop. And like Markiana was saying, at the New Jersey Supreme Court, you're dealt with such unique issues and things that don't have correct answers all the time, which we deal with all the time at the firm as well, because we're trying to, advocate for our client. And there's not always something that has exactly happened the same way before. So I think my experience at the clerkship of getting creative in a sense with what already exists to try to address new things has translated over pretty well. The other thing that I've noticed in my transition is that I've had to switch my mindset a lot. I think both of you have already touched on this a little bit, but when you're a clerk and you're working with a judge, you're trying to come up with the most correct answer and the most fair resolution. And how does this affect later parties down the line? And how is this the best for the citizens of New Jersey or whatever jurisdiction you're in? When you're at a firm, it's how do we get what we want for our client? And it's a completely different mindset, switching from neutral decider to advocate and having to get creative in that sense. So switching my mindset has been not difficult, but it's just something I have to keep in mind sometimes when I'm researching. At the end of the day, the person who I'm doing the research for wants how we can turn this into an argument. It's not just here's all the research and here's what the most fair resolution would be. That's not what we're doing, and that's not what we're getting paid for. But yeah, I think having the clerkship year was extremely helpful, like Nicole was saying, for my confidence as well. But the transition, it definitely does take some time, I will say.
Are there any parts of the transition you found specifically challenging?
I think learning how to adapt to not having one boss anymore has been one of the trickiest parts, because when you're in chambers, it's obvious who the boss is. They like 2 spaces after every period, or they like things to be single spaced or single sided or whatever the case may be. At a firm, you're working for, everyone. I have about 50 plus bosses now. So it's been a challenge figuring that out and figuring out everyone's working style and what they like and what they don't like and what they're looking for, and communication style and what works and what doesn't. And it's all trial and error, and you don't have an exact roadmap to follow. A lot of times in chambers, there literally is a book that somebody wrote with here's how the judge likes everything. I wish that every single person at the law firm came with that. That would be nice, but they don't. And so that has been, I think, the most challenging part that any new associate has to deal with, not just a law clerk, but switching from having one boss to a whole bunch has been a little bit tricky.
Yeah. And Mikayla, another piece of that, it's not just learning the different partners that you're working for, but also prioritizing the work, which is something that comes a lot more naturally when you're working for one person. They know what's on your plate, and there's no other partners that are giving you work, or no other judges that are giving you work. So they are much more naturally involved in helping you prioritize. But when you're working for a bunch of other people, that doesn't always naturally happen. So that's definitely a challenge at the beginning for new associates. So it was for me, for sure.
Yeah, definitely is.
Mikayla, do you find that you miss the camaraderie of chambers? That was always kind of one of my favorite parts of clerking, is that you could easily turn to your co-clerk and be like, hey, can you believe what these litigants are arguing? Am I crazy, or are they crazy? Is this not and I find that while I still occasionally do that at the law firm here, it just doesn't lend itself to it as easily. And sometimes I miss that, especially if I'm the only associate on a case, because we staff our cases pretty leanly, right? So sometimes it's just you and a partner, or maybe you and 2 partners, or a partner and maybe 2 associates, that there isn't even someone I can turn to and have kind of that back and forth about let me walk you through my processing on this issue. I can obviously do it with the partners. Sometimes they're all very welcoming, but I'm obviously not going to go to them unless I have a fully formed thought. And sometimes it's nice to have just a sounding board as you're fleshing things out. And I could always count on my co-clerks for that. And that I feel is not as easy to do because I have plenty of friends at the firm and I do often like ping them and I'm like, hey, do you have 5 minutes to like listen to me chat? But I just like want to talk through something. But obviously, like when everybody's worried about billing their minutes, if it's a matter that somebody's not on, I'm not inclined to like take up their time.
Yeah, totally. But I think on the flip side, clerking can get a little bit lonely in a sense. I mean, obviously you have your co-clerks and the judge and the support staff, but it's the same 3 to 5 people every single day. And I think something that's been exciting about firm life is I'm basically meeting someone new almost every day, still 6 months in. And I think that that's been really exciting. And it's a good way to learn from other people and build your network. And I think it's a great way to break up the monotony of the day.
It is also nice to have practice group experts on hand. So I know for me, I didn't take tax in law school, for example. So whenever like a tax issue comes up, I know like my first phone call is going to be like, Kristen Taylor, what do I do? But Mikayla, your point, you don't really necessarily have someone like that. Obviously, the judge is probably an expert in every issue that comes up. But at a firm, you kind of have a broader base of people who you can reach out to. But agree, Markiana, it's kind of hard sometimes if you're asking for that non-billable time. It makes it a little bit
emotional
stickier.
support time.
Yeah, exactly. I try to give that a lot though, so that I build up that goodwill, and then I can make those phone calls for non-billable talking through issue time because it's so important.
Yeah,
totally.
But that is a good point.
I think the other part of the transition, Amanda, back to your question, that's been, I think, obviously tough that we almost forget about it sometimes is the billable hour mindset and approach. When you're in a clerkship, if you have a question that takes you 3 days to research, no one cares because it's like, well, we want to get the right answer. So yeah, why don't you look at every single state and see how they approach this issue? At a law firm, that's just not feasible. And having to figure out and adjust to billing your time every 6 minutes, it is a skill set that you have to build. So I think that's also been a big part of my transition that obviously any new associate has to deal with. So again, not unique to a clerk, but just because I just had that full year of being able to basically have time to do what I need to do, it's been another tricky part of the transition.
Nicole and Markiana, what advice do you have for a law clerk who's just starting out as an associate at a large law firm?
Yeah, so I think probably my biggest piece of advice, it goes directly to the point Mikayla was making earlier about having multiple bosses and working and the transition between working for one person and just learning the judge's preferences and then joining a law firm where you are working for a multitude of people is learn the partners and associates that you're working with, kind of build that internal manual that you would get at chambers or like when the new law clerks start. They normally overlap with the old law clerks for a couple of days. And so the old law clerks sit you down. They're like, hey, this is what the judge likes. When you're doing this, you have to do it this way. And when you're doing this, you have to do it that way. And when she shuts her door, like, don't bother her. And that kind of thing. So kind of going out of your way to build those kind of resources for yourself and find out exactly what it is that people like, I feel like will make your transition so much easier because everybody has their little idiosyncrasies. And so if you're proactive about it and ask other associates at the firm, hey, this partner asked me to research XYZ issue. Do you think that they would prefer a formal memo? Do you think that they would prefer an email? Like, what's their style? When I send the email, should I attach the cases? Are they going to want to read the cases? Ask those questions. People are absolutely willing to help you. You can always ask, obviously, the partner themselves. People here are very, very approachable. That's like one of the nice things about the place we work, but that may not be true of everybody at every law firm. I've heard some other law firms have partners that aren't so approachable. But either way,
no.
But either way, like if you can't ask the partner or you don't feel comfortable asking the partner, you don't have to. Like the other associates are willing to help you. So just be proactive and find out, kind of ask those questions. And I think a related point is learning to prioritize efficiency before you go and boil the ocean on a particular issue. Make sure that that's one, what the question actually requires, and two, what the partner wants and that they want to spend the time and money doing that. And you don't know what you don't know. And I feel like as a former law clerk, my instinct is always to give the most comprehensive answer at all times. and flip over every stone and rock and make sure I cover absolutely every issue that could possibly arise. And that's not always the ask. At a law firm, it is, in fact, very rarely that that's the ask. Sometimes it is, though. But just make sure that you are answering the question that is asked. And if you think you might need to look at cases from jurisdictions other than where the person told you to look, or you've encountered some other kind of issue, just be proactive about reaching out to whoever gave you the assignment and saying, hey, I've done this research. The answer looks like this, but I think there might be these pitfalls or these other things that we might want to look at. Do you want me to look at them?
That's great advice, because I've learned that it's better to ask the questions in advance than to submit something that they don't want and then have to redo it. So yes, that is great advice. Thank you.
Yeah, I totally agree. Communication is key, because especially at a firm, the focus is the billable hour, and the partner very well likely does not want you to spend 40 hours, even though if you know that's what it takes to get to the right result, you should probably check in after the 10th hour of not finding a definitive answer, just to make sure everybody's on the same page. So yeah, I totally agree. Communication is so important. One thing that I really struggled with is something that Mikayla mentioned earlier. It's kind of just learning how to effectively take on the role as being an advocate for a client, as opposed to being focused on what's right and just and the neutral right answer. Obviously, the right answer is very important, but advocating sometimes requires a little bit more creative thinking. And it's a different way of doing research. And I kind of lost sight of that when I first started. I feel like I dived into everything like I was a law clerk and wasn't that good at thinking with an advocate's mindset. But, you are looking for the right answer. It's just, how do you distinguish your case, and why has this never happened before? Why is your situation particular? And so, yeah, it's a little bit more of a creative way of thinking, which I actually have come to like a lot more, but I was internally resistant to it at first. So I would say just kind of be aware that that might be your inclination after a full year or sometimes more of doing it that way, that, just be aware that you might be feeling that way, because people will give you the criticism and they'll notice it if you don't.
Yeah, I say all the time that clerking is the purest form of practicing law, because all you have to do is research the cases and find the correct answer and decide exactly how things should be. And there's something really just pure and delightful about that. But on the flip side, here at law firms, where we are in the business of making money and we have to get clients to pay us for our bills, the job isn't just to find the right answer. It is to find the right answer, but then make that the right answer for your client, right? So whether it is distinguishing the bad cases or shoehorning the facts to fit your client's case, you got to figure out how to make it work. Or absolutely worst case scenario, be okay, there's no circumstances under which we can do this. It is, in fact, would be wholly frivolous. And it's fun.
Yeah, and I think something that I'm going to have to do, and probably Amanda, you as well, when we go off to clerk in the fall, is when you're clerking, there is no answer in your head already. You're simply trying to be persuaded by what you're reading. That doesn't happen at a law firm. You're not being persuaded by the law. You're finding the law and figuring out how to make it persuasive. And so it's a complete 180. And so I'm glad to hear that both of you remember dealing with it, because I'm trying to switch myself off of it. I think after 6 months I'm getting there, but yeah, it definitely takes some time.
Yeah, it's definitely a hard mental shift. But once you make that shift, it is kind of it's very fun and exciting to find the result that is right for your client. That creative aspect that Nicole mentioned, that rings very true. And it's kind of what keeps the practice of law exciting, at least for me.
Sure. And then just another logistical tip that I don't think I started to take advantage of until a couple of years in. Don't be afraid to take advantage of the resources that a large firm offers. I think when you're used to being in chambers with a couple of people, for me, it was a 3-person chambers with my judicial assistant and the judge. I didn't know how to run a red line. I didn't have someone to print out papers for me. I had to do all of that on my own. And so I kind of just was in the swing of doing all those things myself as a first-year associate. But at a larger law firm, you have, word processing people who can fix up your document and do your table of contents. You have office services who can do printing and binders for you. And there's all these resources that the firm offers to make you quicker at your job, which is really important as a first and second-year associate. So make sure you're aware of what the firm offers and definitely take advantage of it. Don't just do it yourself because that's what you're used to doing.
That's a great point, Nicole. Yeah. That's something I have to remember too, that I often forget.
And Nicole, as a partner, what advice would you give for associates coming off of a clerkship to leverage that clerkship in their role at a law firm?
I would say that sometimes junior associates can be afraid to speak up on a matter or give, advice because they're the most junior person in the room. But at least my experience was a lot of the more senior people that I was working with in my group hadn't clerked before. And so I think it's really important that, juniors shouldn't be afraid to speak up about your experience, especially if you're dealing with your court. And so we deal with the District of New Jersey a decent amount in my practice. And so I would always bring up, I can give Chambers a call. I know so-and-so, or, we've had lunch before. And so it's always good to leverage the relationships or just like learning how, or just offering your advice about who the best person to call is. I think a lot of people who haven't clerked kind of shy away from calling Chambers a little bit. Like it's so official. Like, I've had attorneys say to me before, like, don't call Chambers about that. You can't do that. And I was like, what do you mean you can't do that? You definitely can do that. People call like about way.
Law school graduate is going to pick up the phone and answer your question.
Exactly. And probably panic because they don't know the answer and ask the judicial assistant to help them find the answer. At first, I was a little hesitant to offer that advice to more senior attorneys. But then once I did, they started saying like, we'll go ask Nicole. She clerked. And so she knows. So I feel like a clerk is kind of looked at as it's a really prestigious thing. You can really provide some good practical advice for just communicating with courts and things like that. So don't be afraid to bring that up with the attorneys that you're working for because it's a valuable thing that you can add.
Nicole, I've even noticed that with my peers that I started with who came from law school. Sometimes they'll come to my office and they'll say like, did you deal with this rule when you were clerking, or what's the best way to do this and that? And I think I learned things clerking that I didn't even realize I was learning at the time. And I think you're right that it really humanizes the whole court system more when you realize that there's real people behind the decisions and behind the bench. It's not this like mystical thing of like, we're going to call Chambers. Like, it's just a person. And I was that person 6 months ago. So it's really not a big deal.
It's like, ooh, Chambers.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like the Wizard of Oz. You really get to like peek behind the curtain and you're like, it's just a man with a sheet.
Essentially, yeah.
No offense. The judges are great. They're actually, yes, they are mystical and magical and great.
Of course. But they take their robes off at some point. They're just a person.
If you all could go back to your 3L self, would you apply for that clerkship again?
Yeah, of course.
Definitely.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you all for sharing your experiences transitioning from law clerk to associate and talking about some tips you have for those going through that transition in the future. This has been another episode of the Women's Initiative Network Real Talk. We'll see you next time. Thank you for listening to today's episode. Please subscribe to our podcast series at lowenstein.com/podcasts or find us on iTunes, Spotify, Pandora, Google Podcasts, and SoundCloud. Lowenstein Sandler podcast series is presented by Lowenstein Sandler and cannot be copied or rebroadcast without consent. The information provided is intended for a general audience. It is not legal advice or a substitute for the advice of counsel. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. The content reflects the personal views and opinions of the participants. No attorney-client relationship is being created by this podcast, and all rights are reserved.